Scott here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. Frederick Rutland was an accomplished aviator, British World War I war hero, and real-life James Bond. He was the first pilot to take off and land a plane on a ship, was trusted by admirals of the Royal Navy, and helped design the first modern aircraft carrier. Other than Charles Lindbergh, he was perhaps the most famous early 20th century aviator. Despite all this, and due mostly to class politics, Rutland wasn't promoted in the new Royal Air Force in the wake of World War I. This led to the disgruntled pilot becoming a spy for the Japanese government. He shuttled between Los Angeles and Tokyo, where he lived in large mansions in both Beverly Hills and Yokohama, and embedded himself in both LA high society and Japanese high command. He fed intelligence to the Japanese Navy about the development of America's P-38 aircraft, and went on scouting trips to Pearl Harbor, investigating military preparedness and aircraft technology. He did all this while living a double life, frequenting private California clubs, hosting lavish affairs for Hollywood stars, and partying with Charlie Chaplin and Boris Karloff. Today's guest is Ronald Drapkin, author of Beverly Hills Spy, the double agent war hero who helped Japan attack Pearl Harbor. We look at how Drapkin gathered the intelligence that he did, doing envelope drops, getting a fellow spy hired as a night janitor at a Lockheed plant to steal plans for aircraft development, the overall effect that Drapkin had on Pearl Harbor, and the overall level of Japanese infiltration into America up to and during World War II. Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Ron Drapkin. We're only learning now about the full story of people like Rutland and others due to the recent declassification of World War II documents on spies. But there was always a sense that people like him were out there, stories passed around, secondhand, third-hand information in the decades immediately after the war. Let's start out with your personal connection to espionage and those scraps of information that you heard because you grew up in Los Angeles. You vaguely understood that your father had been working for the U.S. military and counterintelligence, and you discovered that your grandfather had also been involved in intelligence. So can you tell me about what you heard in bits and pieces and how it led to your recent research project?
I think that to start with, I heard a lot about how people were always looking for American technology. So this is an evergreen topic, even, obviously today. But all the aircraft factories, military factories in California, have always been a target. And we heard a lot about that. My father had, before he worked in intelligence, I guess it was an internship for intelligence, but he worked at Lockheed and Douglas as well, getting his way around the factories and being able to chase spies around. And I heard a lot about the Japanese espionage as well, just as family stories. It was a little vague. Unfortunately, there was always a lot of background information and not as much about the actual missions as if you know people in intelligence, that would be what you'd expect they would do.
Right. We'll see that it's amazing the different ways you can infiltrate a factory. You don't necessarily have to be an engineer who's stealing blueprints, but if you're a janitor, you can pick up some really useful tidbits of information. So there are many clever ways to be able to infiltrate a place and get military intelligence. So starting off with Rutland, the main figure in your book, he's interesting because I've looked at spies in World War II and other eras, and they're typically not out of the James Bond mold because you want somebody who is not going to gather attention to himself and attract attention to himself. But sometimes there are exceptions that prove the rule. There's real-life James Bonds like Dusko Popov or Richard Sorge in World War II, playboys that are great at making friends, and this is how they operate. And Rutland is definitely out of this mold. So can you tell me about his early life, World War I, and other things that led to his later career?
Yeah, Scott. First of all, you're absolutely right. He certainly was, I guess they would say, hiding in plain sight. Yeah, he had a very unusual career path. He was born a lower class boy in a southern English town. His father was not just a laborer, but a day laborer, and he was one of 5 children. So he had really no way of getting out of this place other than joining the Royal Navy. He lived over by the British Navy base at Portsmouth in southern England. And you could see him and his friends looking at the ships coming in when they were kids. And the speculation was he joined the Royal Navy because he was hungry. He joined when he was 14. He lied about his age. At that point, you could join as a boy sailor at age 15. He did it at 14. He was about 5'3" at the time. But he quickly bulked up. And when he joined the Navy, the British had a really great training program then. They actually had them do everything from rigging sails on a sailing ship to operating just about any machine, on a ship. And he was a natural talent. He could quickly just fix anything. The torpedoes were electronically operated, so he became both a torpedo expert and an electrical expert. And he also became a diver, going underneath the ships. So he kept getting promoted and promoted and promoted. And after about 10 years, he actually decided he wanted to be an officer and a pilot. And there was a test to do that. And it was, for the most part, almost impossible. In particular, you're taking basically a college examination. He had dropped out of middle school, but he was just an extremely bright, motivated, and hardworking fellow with a chip on his shoulder. And he worked his up and became a pilot. And, soon after World War I erupted and, he was put onto the first aircraft carriers. I guess you would call them a seaplane carrier, where he very quickly became, quite the phenomenon or the star, because these planes were built out of, canvas and they called it matchsticks. His peers, who were from either the military academies or from, Oxford, Cambridge, that kind of thing, he could fix anything and they couldn't. And these planes, their engines broke, their planes broke. So he quickly became the, leading aircraft pilot, of his day. I mean, he first became very famous at the Battle of Jutland, where the Battle of Jutland was 150 British ships against 99 Germans. And in this battle, there was one airplane, which was his. And he flew over the German fleet and reported their position. In his plane, every gun in the German fleet fired at him, and he successfully came back and completed his mission. And everyone could tell, all the visionaries in the navies could tell that, this was a very small plane, very crickety, no armament, but this was the future. Planes were going to, be the future. They were going to get armed. And he was on the leading edge of that. He got promoted again, became the squadron leader. So, the top gun of his, ship, the leading aviator. And typically with his personality, he was extremely good technically. He was the one that was driving all the innovation forward of both the ships and the planes involved. And he really was not a team player. His men didn't like him. His captain didn't like him. And there's a good question about how much of that was due to class. A couple of them were quoted as saying, look, we didn't like this guy. We didn't like, a lower class fellow ordering us around. And how much was just, he just didn't have very good people skills in terms of getting along with his peers.
All right, so we have a ambitious, highly talented individual, bit of an adrenaline junkie with a chip on his shoulder. So this is a volatile mix that is going to lead to something interesting. And I just wanted to say that for him to land on what we call an aircraft carrier, but is really the deck of a warship, I can't emphasize enough how rickety all of these things were in World War I. Just to get involved in combat aviation at this time was risking your life if you were flying in open skies with nobody firing at you. And to land on a deck is not what we think of today. It's more like doing a docking maneuver in orbit with two spacecraft. There is such a narrow window you have where things can work in so many ways that things can fail and go wrong and you could die. So however he ends up later in his life, extraordinary individual. So I could imagine that doing all these things and living for years in an adrenaline-filled, exciting lifestyle, post-war, it's hard to make an adjustment, which leads to his career as a consultant for Mitsubishi. So can you talk about this transition and what he does in Japan?
His career was basically going to be over very quickly. This was right around the time when the Royal Air Force was created from the Royal Flying Corps, which was the Army, the Royal Naval Air Service, which was the Navy. They put it together, the Royal Air Force, and the Navy pilots did not do well politically. So there was that going on. There was Rutland's lower class background. He rubbed people the wrong way. And then there was his wife swapping. Infidelity in an officer after a war is not uncommon, but there's a way to do it, or there was a way to do it in Britain that wouldn't really stick out. Hooking up with the wives of fellow officers was just a bad idea. So for all these reasons, he had no future in the new Royal Air Force. And he was so cranky about it, angry about it, he just walked right into the Japanese Navy at an office in Westminster, and he walked right in and said, looking for a job. And he said, my name is Rutland. And they said, we know exactly who you are. And they gave him a job.
I imagine he's a celebrity when he goes to Japan. He's, like you said, has a reputation already being able to land on aircraft carriers, which is going to be a very important skill in World War II, particularly in the Pacific theater when you're projecting air power over hundreds of miles. So what does he do in Japan, and what does training look like in this period?
Yeah, the Japanese were quickly becoming the third largest navy in the world after the US and Britain. The aircraft carriers weren't exactly working. They had their first one, the Hoso, and they had some planes, but the planes were basically British imports. The pilots were often British, and the carriers weren't quite working for them for a bunch of reasons. And the Japanese Navy had a clever plan to tell the British he was going to work for Mitsubishi, but actually was going to work for the Japanese Navy directly. So they hired him, they brought him over, and they didn't put him in the foreign settlement, but they put him on the beach near the main Japanese Navy port of Yokosuka. And the British never knew about this. They've got a 1,000-page file on him, but they never knew that he was actually working directly for the Navy. And so we actually found some old Japanese memoirs that were out of print through some friends in the Japanese naval forces today. And what it told us was that he was staying in this small town, and he had basically the Japanese officers would come and go visit him in plain clothes so as to not get attention, and consulted with him on the new aircraft carriers and how to fix them up.
He does this for a few years, and eventually he moves to Hollywood as an emissary for the Japanese Navy. Can you talk about this, how his career in Japan then leads to Los Angeles and what these years look like?
Yeah, so he starts out really just as a technical consultant there, and he teaches them everything he knows, and that goes on for a few years, but at some point his information starts to get out of date, right? So he goes back to Britain, and, as you were saying, Scott, as an adrenaline junkie, he took a job with his brother-in-law's company. Your listeners may be familiar with Thomas the Tank Engine. In Thomas the Tank Engine, there's a couple of very evil trucks trying to put trains out of business, and that's the company that he worked for, a trucking company, and doing sales of, big trucks and such. So he was bored, and one day he gets a letter from the Japanese consulate in London saying, "We'd like to talk to you." And he goes and talks to them, and they have a nice walk in the Riverside Park over there in London. And they say, "We've got an offer for you. We need some more help. Technology is moving very quickly." At this point, the navies were still flying the wooden biplanes, right? But it was very clear that very soon everyone's going to be moving to all metal monoplanes with, double the speed, much faster things. And I needed to keep abreast of what was going on. And the most interesting technological innovations were happening in California, where all the aircraft manufacturers had moved. And they said, "We'd like you to move to California, to Hollywood." And, this was a bit of a shock to him. He hadn't dreamed of anything like this. But he moved to Hollywood and took up a position where he'd be able to figure out what was going on in the aircraft industry.
From this point on in Hollywood, he's able to enter into the social scene, mingle about. So what is his cover? What does his day-to-day life look like as he's trying to gather intelligence?
Yeah, he decides he's going to be a trading company CEO. So he makes his own trading company. He knows a lot of traders from his old days in Yokohama, right? And from there, he kind of goes into the local British colony. And this was in the early days of Hollywood. So many of the early actors and actresses were actually British. And, it's an interesting factoid that they all came over there in the silent movie days when Americans didn't know that, they didn't hear the British accent, right? And there was some question whether, when the talkies came out, if people would actually like this British accent. Turns out they did. So, he joins the social clubs, and, he's there with, in the social clubs. One of the famous ones is called the British United Services Club. It still exists today in Hollywood. And it's a club for British veterans. And at the time, the members were, Charlie Chaplin didn't join. He wasn't, a joiner. But, Boris Karloff, Alan Mowbray, Nigel Bruce, Errol Flynn, Basil Rathbone were all members of this club. And, he was a very popular fellow, partly because, he was very good at, pressing the flesh. But in particular, he was, he had all this money from the Japanese Navy. And so he had a house that it's up on the Bird Streets in Hollywood. I looked on Zillow. It's currently going for about $14 million. It's on a double lot overlooking Hollywood and the ocean, right? And what he's able to do is basically just pay for everyone's dinner. Every time we go out, he's picking up the check, which, in the Depression would make anyone popular, right?
Absolutely. And Before getting into the details of what he did, I'd like to take a step back because we're getting into the meat of his spying career. And I'd like to look at motivations. It's hard to know because a lot of what we do know comes from observations from declassified MI5 files. But what made him do this? And also, can you give us his perspective? Because when we look at a British man who's spying on behalf of Imperial Japan, we're looking backwards, and we know all the atrocities that fascist Japan inflicts on the rest of Asia, and it looks terrible. But for the 1930s, things are a little bit different. There are a number of people who are fascinated with Japan and East Asia as this exotic culture. Charlie Chaplin is a Japanophile, and it seems like this exciting, exotic place where you go on adventures. There's the airplane called the China Clipper that was called that because it was a plane that would ferry people on these long, exotic voyages. So all I'm saying is that the perspective is different of why somebody would do this at the time. So can you help me understand why he did what he did?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really good point you make. Hindsight's 2020. My father used to talk about that all the time in terms of, espionage. We didn't know then what we know now, right? And in particular, back, when Rutland first went to Japan and Britain were actually allies. Japan was on the Allied side in World War I. And, so if you think about it, when someone's being, he was originally said, they originally said to him, you could be a sleeper. A sleeper would mean he's just going there, he's taking their money, he's hanging out, he's being glamorous, and doesn't have to do anything until a war breaks out. And that's not exactly what happened, but, if you think a war will never break out, in your mind, you're just taking their money, you're kind of outsmarting everyone, right? So there's a couple things going on. One is that, it didn't seem as bad as it was, And then secondly, what he was being asked to do, no one really thought it would, come to, well, some people thought it would come to war, but it just wasn't the common way of looking at things.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors. Some of the most important stuff he does is, as you mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, is gather intelligence on avionics, specifically at the Lockheed plant in Burbank. And he has an interesting method of infiltration. So how does he do this?
So what he's doing is he figures he needs to send someone in there. And, we don't know all the details, but it's pretty well documented in the recently declassified FBI files. He was hanging out with his buddies, Alan Mowbray and Boris Karloff. And he had a friend, he met someone who worked at Lockheed who was saying they needed a night janitor. And he found this fellow that had been working for his buddy, Boris Karloff, and hired him to send him in to the factory. The exciting thing, as you were hinting at earlier in the broadcast, Scott, was, a janitor is a great place for a spy. And the best janitor for espionage would be the night janitor, because he's going around the plant, at night, right? So he's picking things up. And so that's who he hired. He hired this guy, sent him in, and had him pull out information. And it was not immediately discovered. Maybe it should have been, because it was, a little bit ironic that, he was a social climber, and he hired this fellow he sent in was an Irishman who was apparently working with the Irish nationalists, the IRA, right? Not exactly the profile of the fellow who's hanging out with, a glamorous Englishman, but that's who he chose.
Particularly, he's looking at the development of the P-38, the fighter plane, which it really makes you wonder what sort of fingerprints we can see on the war from Rutland and the particular strategies that Japan develops. They know exactly the fighter plane they're going to go against. And do you have any sense from beginning with Rutland and the intelligence drops, the letters he would write to Japanese high command, they're seeing this, they're understanding the military and aviation capabilities of the United States. Is there a way to know, or do we have to speculate from one end to the other?
We're speculating quite a bit, but I can tell you what we know, which is fairly clear. We know exactly what they asked him to get, right? So we know they were very concerned about the range and the armament of the planes. As you know, in the Pacific War, as opposed to the European War, the distances were so much further. And then because of the, it was an ocean, right? If the plane goes down, it may not be found, right? And so the secrets that the Americans were coming up with were, a lot of it was around the structure of the airplanes, the wind tunnel work that was well known, and as well as, the engines. And, 3 months after this Lockheed incident, this documented in the FBI files, several engineers from Mitsubishi come over to Los Angeles. We found the records of that. They go and meet with him. And, and right after that, he goes over to Tokyo and meets with the naval ministry there.
Beyond the Lockheed plant, how else was he gathering intelligence? And yes, he was a sleeper agent, so he might have simply been making the social rounds and making himself a person who was well-connected and ready and able to do what he needed to do when he was activated. But we know a bit about his process of writing letters, dropping off at a dead drop, how he addressed his handlers in Japan, how he was addressed. So could you walk through that process and, based on later declassified intelligence, what we do know or what intelligence agencies were speculating that he was trying to do?
There was two parts of it. One was, if you send someone into the plant, they might get the actual blueprints, which he couldn't get. But he clearly found he'd get a lot of information. As you were saying at the start of the broadcast, he was hiding in plain sight as a very glamorous fellow. And in the parties he invited at his house and at the social club, there was really two kinds of folks there. And this is all documented in the newspaper articles of the time. First of all, it's the actors and actresses. And secondly, it was U.S. military. So he was inviting, the admirals from the U.S. Pacific Fleet to these parties. And, one thing that's, very obvious in the files and also in common sense is, if they think he's a British war hero and he gets them drunk and he asks them about the capabilities of a new plane, they're going to tell him, right? So he was able to both get high-level information just by going out drinking with people. And this is you mentioned the Richard Zorge case. That was how Zorge got his information, right? Just you go get people drunk, get him information, plus the low-level information that he would get from the plan. So you put that all together, and you've got a pretty good picture.
He also leads a lavish lifestyle. This is part of how he's able to pry information out of people, pay for their bills at the end of the night. So this is helpful, but it also becomes suspicious because later on, people wonder, what exactly does this guy do when he's a stockbroker who never tries to sell any stock? So can you describe this part of his lavish lifestyle and the disparity between what he says he does and what he's actually doing and the gap between?
Yeah. He started out, as a trading company fellow. He later became a stockbroker. What appears to have happened was, the stockbroker thing was a good way of, what we would today call money laundering. He was getting money sent to him to pay for his things, and they would send stock rather than cash, to avoid being observed. And what they realized was that not only was he not selling really any stock, but he was busy. It was a lot like we would call it like a venture capitalist today, right? So at the time, there's all these startup aircraft companies with their own technologies, right? And, being a stockbroker, he could go around and meet them and ask them about their planes and learn a lot of information as well. And then from there, it's his time in the social club was, he never hid anything. He was all hiding in plain sight. But it started to get more and more suspicious, especially around 1939, when the tension between Japan and the U.S. started getting worse and worse. And he spent a good month there in Japan, right at the start of World War II in Europe. So it was 1939. And he's there, he's just, he's playing around, and it seems like he's gallivanting around, and it just seemed, suspicious to the actors, finally.
Eventually, U.S. authorities become suspicious of him. What happens that they become suspicious of him, and why does he eventually decide to go back to Britain in response?
People started getting suspicious of him, and in the FBI docs, some of the British actors actually went to the FBI and said, look, we think there's something going on here. We didn't think he was a problem, but it's not adding up. It's like there's a, war in Europe. We're British. Britain's in a war. And he's just gallivanting around and just having just a little too good of a time. And the FBI puts that together with the information from, Lockheed, where they're saying, like, there's a suspicious guy there. The Lockheed security guys were, trying to help the FBI and figure out where this guy came from, and his name pops up there as well. So the FBI start, putting this all together. You asked when he went back to Britain. So for a while there, he got to be closer to the U.S. Navy folks and, decided he would maybe try to help there. But it got more and more suspicious, and the FBI decided he needed to be, removed from the situation. And the problem they had was, this would have been really hot. If this had gotten out right now, at that time, there was a very sensitive situation between Japan and the U.S., as well as Britain and the U.S. So, Britain is trying to get the U.S. to come into the war against the Nazis, and they're very, very sensitive to, any bad PR, right? So the Brits, basically no one wants this to get out. They need it covered up. And the way they talk to him about it is, he goes and he talks to them, and the British talk to him, and the British and the FBI basically say, look, we've got the goods on you. And there's really only one way for you to avoid prosecution, which is, to go back to Britain and not make things look bad in the U.S. And I don't know what the British exactly promised him, but it seems like they promised him more than they would give him, which was, eventually they arrested him, but they promised him that he would, get back and maybe be able to help out in Britain, with the war. And so that's what they did. They flew him back. There's a, kind of an interesting anecdote where he says to them, look, the Japanese trust me, and because the Japanese trust me, we got to keep it this way. And so I want you to fly me back to Britain, not take a ship. Because if you're spending money on me, that means, I'm a VIP and you trust me and therefore my information is valuable. At the time, the Germans were sinking ships all the time and you couldn't buy an airline ticket, but he'd got a plane ticket back to Britain there.
How do they convince him that they have the goods on him? Is there a particular smoking gun that British intelligence can say proves he's guilty, or is it a preponderance of evidence is all they have? They just have a bunch of speculation from well-placed British veterans or officers, and they're able to scare him into thinking they have the dirt on him. Do you have a sense one way or another?
Yeah, the British basically were getting information from the FBI. And the FBI had arrested a couple of Japanese spies in mid-1941, a fellow named Tachibana in particular. And when they raided his files, they found the correspondence from Rutland in his files. So the FBI and the British, they weren't cooperating exactly that well, but, basically the FBI said, look, we've got the goods on this guy. We can have him shot, or you can take him. And so the Brits were like, okay, we have the goods on you.
He goes back to England, and after Pearl Harbor is interned under a wartime act that allows people to be interned without trial. What happens at that point? It sounds like they suspect him of being directly involved or being a principal member supplying intelligence that allows Pearl Harbor to happen. Can you describe that period and what's going on?
So he gets back to England and he tries to join MI6. He says, take me or join naval intelligence. And MI5 says, this is not going to happen. We can't, trust this guy. Right. And one thing that's a little bit, to me, a little, sad or something on the fellow is when he gets the news about, first of all, the, Pearl Harbor attack, and then a couple of days later, the Japanese ship sink a couple of British ships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. He had served on the Repulse. And obviously, the fact that he had helped enable his old shipmates to be, killed, right? He couldn't have been happy about this. And he writes them a letter to the Navy saying, look, I'll do anything. I'm an experienced ship captain. He said, I can drive a small boat. I can pilot a small boat. And so if they had accepted his services, you could have seen him, being one of the captains of the small boats that took the people ashore on D-Day. But that's not what happened. Just a few days after the Pearl Harbor attack, there was a knock on his door and it said, come with us. And they put him into Brixton Prison. As you said, there was no trial. They didn't really have the evidence to put him away, but they didn't need it. They put him away without trial.
He is able to rely on his reputation, and other Royal Navy colleagues call for his release. He still has a reputation as a war hero. What happens during his internment, and how is he eventually able to get out?
Yeah, it's a kind of a shocking thing. There was a lot of the Royal Navy admirals had served with him in the First War, and they respected him, and they didn't believe that he was, what he was being, they said he was guilty of. And one of them, a fellow named Admiral Keyes, he actually was a good friend of Churchill's who had founded the Royal Navy Commandos. He got up in the House of Commons and he said, he made a very angry speech saying this guy that MI5, MI6 screwed up by not listening to him, and he's still a good asset. And, it got kind of, they were trying to avoid embarrassment, but it didn't work. It became very embarrassing.
At this time, he's in Britain, but he's separated by his family. What do the final years of his life look like, and how do things eventually come to an end? Scott here. One more break for a word from our sponsors.
He's not a model prisoner. He wants out. He thinks he's been wronged, and he's very smart. And he does, he files lawsuits. He has his wife file a lawsuit against some U.S. Navy people in California, trying to get evidence that he was, innocent, what they accused him of. And he even finds out the names of the MI5 interrogators, and he starts writing them letters at their houses. He writes letters to, several hundred members of parliament. He makes, quite the nuisance of himself. And, at that point, his brother, wealthy brother, the industrialist, gets arrested for tax evasion, which I believe, we don't know this for sure, it doesn't say this, but trying to put pressure on Rutland, saying you chill out and, we might let your brother-in-law out of jail. So it gets, nastier and nastier. And after the war, the British Navy, the MI5 and Navy files, they go really silent, and we don't really know that much. There's some interviews from his kids who say he's very angry. And one day his eldest son gets a suicide note, and it just says, look, my time on this earth is done. I've had a very exciting life. I don't want to bore you and the other kids with my stories anymore. And I don't want some kid to find me or something. So here's where I'll be, and just, go pick me up and get the police. His oldest son is, panics, runs out to where he was. His father's not there, but he gets a call from the police anyway, saying there's we found a man who's committed suicide in a hotel room. And he goes, identifies it, and that's his father, who's in theory committed suicide.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on his personal legacy, but also his influence on the war. And in particular, he can help us answer a difficult and somewhat delicate question of the level of Imperial Japanese infiltration into the United States up to and during wartime, because this question is what justified the internment of Japanese Americans during the war. And on the one hand, I think people today are sensitive to pry open this question because they don't want to give credence that America was justified in interning Japanese Americans to the level they did during the war. On the other hand, every single modern nation state is heavily involved in espionage and infiltration. You don't deserve to be a modern nation state if you're not trying to actively infiltrate your enemy. America, of course, was trying to do this in Japan and in Europe. Germans were doing this in America. Russians were doing this in America, vice versa. Everyone was doing it to everyone. So, of course, Japan would be trained to do this in the United States because you need intelligence to effectively prosecute a war effort. So, with this in mind, what do you see as Rutland's legacy?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to answer the question here. As you say, yes, every nation, does their own espionage. And it's of note that, as we all know, no Japanese American was ever, convicted of helping the Japanese Navy or the Japanese military spy effort. What people may not know is that the Japanese Navy didn't really try. They didn't trust the Japanese Americans. They knew the Japanese Americans were acting, rather like Americans, which, they were, right? So, the Japanese Americans weren't involved at all. And so it's a little baffling. I think, we could get into a lot of speculation here, but, really, I think the biggest cause was that it was, a lot of things were stirred up in the press. William Randolph Hearst was known for inflaming passions with things that weren't entirely true.
Largely speaking, do you think he did have an effect on the war, boosting Japan, making it easier for Pearl Harbor to happen, increasing the strategic abilities of the Japanese Air Force and being able to strike American aircraft? Or was his influence more negligible than that?
We can't say for sure, but we do know, that he did a very, we do know is that in the initial creation of the Japanese Carrier Strike Force in the early 1920s, he was there meeting them. He was there every week, and he was very influential at that point. In the 30s, You spend enough time with the Japanese admirals, you're clearly bringing something of value. And, one of the things that's new that people hadn't realized was, on his trips to Japan, he typically stopped in Hawaii because, the China Clippers or the ships, the Matson ships stopped there. And so he spent really a lot of time in Pearl Harbor over the years, just drawing out the base itself. So that's really of note as well.
Well, we're continuing to learn things about World War II as files like these are declassified and filling in the blanks, adding more nuance and color to what was happening during the war. And this is a great contribution to that. And for listeners who want to check out Ronald's book, the name of it is Beverly Hills Spy, Double Agent War Hero Who Helped Japan Attack Pearl Harbor. Ron, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Scott.
All right, that is all for today's episode. If you'd like to see show notes for this and all my other episodes and include sources, maps, or other relevant information, go to parthenonpodcast.com. Parthenon is the name of the podcast network that History Unplugged is a part of, along with other great history shows like James Early's Key Battles of American History, Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, and other shows as well. If you'd like to support History Unplugged, there are two easy ways to do so. The first is to subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. This really helps the show grow. The second thing is to join our membership program on Patreon. And if you do so, you can get completely ad-free episodes of the entire back catalog of the show, which is 600 episodes and growing. Just go to patreon.com/unplug. Thanks for listening and see you next time.